Welcome to Tracking the Cross podcast, where we get into the nitty-gritty of the times. This episode will be on the Great Train Wreck of 1888, which happened in Blackshear, Georgia. Most of this episode will be a reading from the book History of Pierce County. On St. Patrick's Day in 1888, there occurred in Blackshear one of the worst train derailments in all of history. Number 27, a fast mail and passenger train of Savannah, Florida and Western Railroad, was due to Blackshear at about 9:30 a.m. on March 17th for its regular run from Savannah to Jacksonville, and it was traveling in two sections, 15 minutes apart. The first section of the train was on schedule as it was passing Owens between Patterson and Blackshear. The engine sounded its whistle, and the routine signal of the 27 would soon be along. In Blackshear, H.J. Clark, depot agent, readied baggage to meet the train. As the engine of the first section started across the 37-high trestle over the Alabaha River, 1 mile east of Blackshear, the engine had its first warning that tragedy was about to strike. Clark reported later that he felt something give under the wheels of his locomotive. Something was wrong, but by that time the engine was already halfway through the trestle. The engineer made a quick decision. He gave the locomotive full throttle, hoping that the train would reach the other side safely. The engine did reach safely, but it was as cleared to the edge of the trestle that the entire structure, which was made out of wood, seemed to give away. He turned, horror-stricken, to see that the entire train, 5 or 6 cars, and even the locomotive tender had collapsed into the riverbed. The engineer slowed his engine, quickly ordering the firemen to drive on to Blackshear to get help, and then he leaped from the locomotive and ran back. After the impact of the tragedy dawned on him, he started to think of the second section of Train 27. He did not hesitate at the scene of the wreck, but made his way across the dry riverbed and walked up the hill on the other side, and ran approximately 2 miles and flagged down the other section near Owens. Meanwhile, in Blackshear, the engine dragged a fragment of the tender, with only one fireman in the cab, was seen approaching the station. The fireman was in a dazed condition and seemed to be unable to stop the engine, but when he did, he grabbed a piece of timber and put it under the wheel. A crowd quickly gathered. The fireman could tell nothing except that he supposed that the train was in the creek. "Go to the river," he said. Immediately, people who gathered began to hurry towards the trestle. One of the first men in Blackshear to hear about the disaster was John B. O'Neill, then a youth of 20 years, clerking for his father-in-law, Allen N. Smith, in the general store located in Blackshear Drug Company, corner of later years. Another was John T. Brantley, also then a young man, who was in Brantley's store on the other side of the present Pierce Trading Company department store. Mr. Brantley and Mr. O'Neill ran as fast as they could to the wreck and were among the first from Blackshear to arrive. A few people from homes near the trestle were already at the scene. They were attempting to give first aid to the wounded and dying, but with little success since there was no medical supplies. Someone thought of the cotton batting used in the Brantley turpentine still near Blackshear, so young John B. O'Neill and John B. Brantley ran again to town and loaded batting under each arm from the turpentine still stock room and ran back to the scene of the train wreck. When the first people from Blackshear arrived, they met the engineer who made his way back to the scene from near Owens. "Can we do anything for you?" one of the crowd inquired of him. "Yes, you can go down there and help the wounded and dying," he said, pointing to the broken bridge. A heart-wrenching scene met the eyes of those who arrived. Debris was scattered all around the riverbed. Some of the injured had crawled from the cars and were sitting up. Others were clinging in the arms of friends. Still, others laid in the seat, cushions, sleeper mattresses, etc. The groans of the suffering were distressing beyond the power of language to describe, an eyewitness later reported. Mr. O'Neill, Mr. Brantley, and Tracy Acost were some of the young men from Blackshear who went to work to assist the injured and dying. Buckets of water had been brought to put out the fire that started with the wreck. Some of the injured could not be reached in time and died while rescuers fought to remove the wreckage which covered them. There were 4 doctors in Blackshear in 1888, and all went immediately to the scene and began to administer to the wrecked victims. These doctors were Dr. A.M. Moore, Dr. H.J. Smith, Dr. H. Lamar Watley, and Dr. R.W. Fuller. They all worked tirelessly and later refused to accept pay for their services. Several famous people were among the passengers on the train. One of these was George Gold, son of famous financier Jay Gold, whose attempt to corner the gold market brought on Black Friday of 1869 and disrupted the nation's whole credit structure. George Gold was traveling with his wife, who was expecting a baby. Realizing her condition, she was injured. Rescue workers erected a tent of sheets so that Mrs. Gold could lie in privacy from other injured persons. Mrs. Gold was later brought to Brown House along with several other wounded, and apparently she suffered no major injuries, leaving several days later with her husband in a special railroad car. She praised the workers of the wreck, particularly the women of Blackshear, saying, "I never saw such a gallant of brave ladies in my life." Another famous person involved in the disaster was Elijah P. Wilbur, president of the Lehigh Valley Railroad of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He was traveling with his invalid son, M. A. Wilbur, in a private railroad car. An invalid child means a child who is physically or mentally incapable of earning a living. With them were 3 other relatives. The son, M. A. Wilbur, was severely injured in the train wreck, and as he lay dying, they offered him whiskey to help with his injuries. Mrs. Cox, believed to be the aunt of the young man, is reported to have been saying, "He came into this world without a strong drink in him, let him go out the same way." Young Wilbur died before he could be removed for treatment. While recalling the events later that day, Mr. O'Neill said that after working all day, on the 17th and into the night, he fainted from fatigue. When he came to, some of the ladies assisting him in rescue work were rubbing his arms with whiskey. He stated that he got up and felt better and continued to work all night at the disaster site, even reporting for work at the store the next day. The ladies of Blackshear were credited with great courage and coolness in assisting the injured of the wreck. Newspaper accounts from that day said that most Blackshear women, young ladies, married ladies, grandmothers, walked to the scene of the tragedy despite the horrible scene and nerve-shattering events, working through the heat of the sun and assisting those who needed help. Special mentions were Mrs. R. S. Middleton, Mrs. J. A. Harper, Miss Ava Acost, Miss Meta McKinney, Miss A. M. Moore, and others. The dead from the wreck were laid out in the old wooden depot station that later burned in Blackshear. The injured were sent on immediately to the hospital by train, and the scene at the depot as relatives arrived to identify their kin was one of those of sorrow and pathos. Mr. O'Neill was put in charge of collecting valuables of those hurt and killed in the wreck, and the reason being that Allen Smith's store had the biggest safe in town. He wrapped the watches, rings, jewelries, and other items in sheets and brought them into town, later issuing them to the owners or the relatives upon identification. Some thievery took place at the wrecked scene, according to a dispatch from the Savannah correspondent of the Atlanta Constitution, said this: "Those who have returned from the wreck say bodies of the dead were heartlessly robbed by ghoulish thieves." Editor A. Allenwood of Pierce County Journal, however, branded this charge as false. A Blackshear man, W. E. Lockhart, on the trip to Savannah 2 days later, also upheld a good name in Blackshear citizens, giving the Morning News this report. One man at the wreck was discovered in the act of removing a ring from the finger of Mr. Smith, a Pullman conductor, and was promptly stopped, and he left. There was talk of swinging him to a limb at the time, and citizens of Blackshear proposed to investigate the matter further. The Great Blackshear Wreck of 1888 was believed to have been caused by a brake mechanism which fell from its place, ripping cross ties from the track, and when it hit the wooden trestle, it quite literally tore the bridge from under the train. Mr. O'Neill said, a few years before he passed away, that the old tender, which held fuel and water for the locomotive, was still at the bottom of the river. One incident occurred when Mr. George Gould's top hat, which was completely crushed in the incident. He went to Blackshear trying to find one to replace it and was disappointed that none was available. This is the same Mr. Gould whose wife was injured and whose dad calls Black Friday. Before leaving Blackshear, Mr. Gould went to a local store and had some bills exchanged for coins in nickels, dimes, and quarters. And as his special car pulled away from the railroad station on that day, he reached in his pocket and grabbed a handful of coins and tossed them at the crowd standing by. There was a scramble. It was said that youngsters found nickels, dimes, and quarters in the sand at the depot for months following. Captain H.G. Fleming, superintendent of the Savannah, Florida Western Railroad, came personally from Savannah to settle claims against the railroad because of the accident. He wrote checks for many thousands of dollars for damage from the wreck in Blackshear. All those who assisted at the scene refused to take pay for their services, though it was offered. Many, however, were given free passes on the railroad line. Captain Fleming offered to pay Mr. O'Neill or issue him a pass. Although he had never been to Jacksonville, he offered to take the pass from Blackshear to Jacksonville. However, Mr. O'Neill still had the pass in his home in Blackshear when he died October 1953, 65 years later. D. N. Baldwin and Son, photographers from Albany, Georgia, made pictures of the 1888 train derailment, which then sold for 75 cents. They also published a list, not complete, of the victims of Pierce County's most tragic incident in history. The photographic list headed the statement as follows. This photographic scene of the terrible wreck of the first mail train from Savannah to Jacksonville on the SFW Railway, the morning March 17, 1888. The train went through the trestle 37 feet high over Little Satilla 1 and a quarter mile away from Blackshear, Georgia. The list of killed and wounded is sufficiently sad commentary on the fearful fatality of the disastrous incident. I will now be reading the list, incomplete list, of those who were killed. William A. Martin of Union News Company, C.E. Van Orst, W.B. Ganger, C.A. Fulton, F.M. Smith, Fred Maynard, J. Pappy, Sam Allen, Mrs. Hubbard, John T. Ray, Major J. H. Pate, E. P. Thompson, Mrs. G. W. Kelly, W. H. McGriff, Mrs. W. A. Shaw, M. A. Wilbur, J. H. Hulbert, Charles Pierce, Coffee Williams, Lloyd Dawson, Caesar Foster, Moses Gate. The people just listed are from all over the United States. The complete list will be found on our Facebook. The number of the dead in, quote, Hurricane Creek wreck has been given by various sources from 17 people to 37. The D. N. Baldwin and Son list shows 22 killed and 33 injured, some seriously, so the figure of 17 dead is undoubtedly an error. The late John B. O'Neill said that the number of dead was either 27 or 37. At least 5 in Baldwin's list were shown as badly injured or dead since, so the number of deaths from the wreck was probably about 27. The rail disaster near Blackshear inspired a poem of 133 verses written by N. M. Pafford of Willacoochee, Georgia, entitled Sorry of the Wreck. I won't be reading the poem here, but you can find it on our Facebook at Tracking the X. Thank you for listening to this episode of Tracking the Cross podcast. We are so thankful that you have listened through the whole episode and continue to support our journey as we retell local history. Be sure to check out our YouTube channel at Tracking the X as we explore the actual location of where the derailment happened. Thank you so much.